U.S. expression to improve relations with Pakistan. Is this too much to read, or is there more to it that one needs to understand?
This statement, although understandably very well received in Pakistan, especially given the follow-up by the security advisor and the defense secretary, the picture seems to be showing, had it to Pakistani intelligence, which is interesting in itself. It means there is a relationship here which is continued.
The terrorism has risen in Afghanistan. Do you think that in the forthcoming U.S. national security strategy, perhaps this administration will value terrorism as a greater threat to U.S. national security than the Biden administration? And that provides an opportunity for Pakistan and Washington to come closer?
One way in which it might be useful for Pakistan is it may embolden Pakistan now, just on the basis of getting this recognition, to take a tougher line on Afghanistan.
Initial weeks of the President Trump's return to White House, we have witnessed a few calculated surgical strikes against high-value targets of Daesh and Al-Qaeda in Syria and also in Africa. So do you think instead of a large-scale military commitment, which Mr. Trump is unlikely to be interested in, this is the method and strategy which his administration is likely to continue and pursue?
Well, I would love to. It will use it, but we have all the evidence we have is that if it's going to be effective now, Pakistan would play a major role in that. Whether Pakistan would find it in its interests, how far it would be willing to go to do this, we'll have to see. That Pakistan has an opportunity here to further strengthen the relationship.
Three specific terrorist organizations like BLA, BLF, and TTP. Which organizations do you think provide an opportunity for Washington and Islamabad to cooperate against?
And that's limited mainly at this point to Daesh, perhaps Al-Qaeda.
We have heard more recently about the infighting and the power struggle between the Haqqani network and the Kandhari group. What is your forecast of the stability and the strength of hold on power of the current Afghan Taliban administration?
Something important has happened recently, and that is that the hardliners have virtually taken over. The U.S. has no leverage to speak of in Afghanistan today. It has no real ability. Its only ability is through others like Pakistan.
Viewers, very warm welcome to another episode of V News English program Perspectives, in which we bring before you some of the most insightful perspectives from around the world of the leading strategic thinkers that know and understand the most critical issues that the world faces today. So today, we are joined by one of the leading authorities on South Asian political and security affairs, Professor Dr. Marvin Weinbaum. Although he does not need an introduction, but definitely deserves one. He has taught perhaps three generations of scholars who have studied and analyzed South Asian politics and security, and is considered a legend and one of the most senior expert and authority on South Asian affairs, and has been advising the US government in some of the most critical eras, including immediately after 9/11, when it was looking after the policy Analysis Department of the State Department. His analysis, input, and perspective is respected, valued. He has testified a number of times before the U.S. Congress, advised the U.S. government, and is frequently sought after for his very valuable and insightful views on South Asian security dynamics. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Weinbaum.
And thank you for your introduction. Much too kind. But thank you.
No, I mean, let me confess, the first book on South Asian politics that I read included a chapter on it from you. So let me acknowledge that as a student of international relations. That's a great honor to have you on my show. Let me start off by asking you that the last couple of days saw some extraordinary developments in the US regarding South Asia. I'm sure you witnessed President Trump's first address before the US Congress after he returned to the Oval Office, which the international observers keenly watched in order to gain insight into his thinking, his concerns, his threat perceptions, his priorities. And like most observers, I was also surprised when, despite castigation of enemies and friends and allies alike, he chose the opportunity to appreciate Pakistan and its cooperation with the US in the counter-terrorism domain, and recognize the Pakistan support in bringing one of the most wanted terrorists, who was directly responsible for killing of 13 American servicemen and killing of hundreds of Afghans in August 2021 to justice. But his appreciation at the US Congress was reinforced within 24 hours by an important first phone call made by the US National Security Advisor directly to Pakistan's Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Mr. Safdar, reiterating and appreciating Pakistan's support and contribution in bringing a very important high-value US target involved in terrorism justice. And later on, the US Secretary of Defense also echoed and reinforced this sentiment while speaking to media. So I wanted to ask you, what has brought this sort of change of heart in the US government? It was viewed that Pakistan under the Biden administration had stable relations, but it seems Islamabad is interpreting these three statements as US expression to improve relations with Pakistan. Is this too much to read, or is there more to it that one needs to understand?
Well, thank you for having me on your show. I think that Pakistan has to be careful not to overstate what has happened. For his State of the Union address, naturally, the president presents the best picture he can of what has really been only 6 weeks of his tenure in returning to the presidency. This was a statement made which came with great surprise, not only for Pakistan, but here, because I know I was asked a few times what to expect for Afghanistan and Pakistan in the presidential address. And I said, no way. Neither Afghanistan or Pakistan will be mentioned. They're just, that's not the kind of boasting that he will do, unless, as it turns out, this could be seen as a feather in his cap. Now, the apprehension of this important Islamic State figure who has been linked to the attack in Afghanistan as the evacuation was taking place. So what I'm saying here is this statement, although understandably very well received in Pakistan, especially given the follow-up by the security advisor and the defense secretary. But the only figure that really counts here is the president in this administration. They fall in line. There's no, at this point, there's no independent thinking. Everything is very much in line with what the president has said and is likely to do. Okay, so how did this come about? What we know is that U.S. intelligence had located this terrorist, if you will, had located him, had communicated this the picture seems to be showing, had it to Pakistani intelligence, which is interesting in itself. It means there is a relationship here which is continued, which shouldn't surprise us, because it's to everybody's interest to share at least certain intelligence. Now, we know Afghanistan has turned this around and said, you see, this means that Islamic State, ISIS, whatever you want to call it, has a major presence in Pakistan. So that was, for Afghanistan, that was used against Pakistan. But the fact is that, having been informed, it's true Pakistan could have paused, it could have done nothing with this, but saw an opportunity here to ingratiate itself with the United States. And this therefore became important for Pakistan and its hope for a strengthening of relationships, and for the president, in that he had a feather in his cap now, that in addition to, because he spoke primarily about domestic, he could use for international purposes. And the issue of the 15 American deaths, not to mention 115 or so civilians who were killed in that attack that took place in Kabul in August of 21, that was, yeah, I thought my thought for a second, but that was important domestically in the United States, because that attack has had, the Republicans have used that very much against the Democrats in arguing a failed policy in Afghanistan, when in fact it was the Trump administration that began the negotiations to leave, and had actually set a date in May when U.S. troops were out, and Biden extended it. And then because of the then virtual collapse of the Afghan forces, then the end unfolded very quickly, and we had the chaos that we saw in August of 21. So that's a long answer here. It served both countries, certainly domestically for the United States, to demonstrate that its arm reaches far out, and Pakistan to say, we were singled out, but Pakistan should not make too much of this. I think fundamentally nothing much has changed, or if it is going to change, we'll have to see it. One measure would be U.S. policy towards India, and we don't see any indication that the U.S. is backing off with India. The U.S. is putting pressure on Afghanistan now, mainly on this issue of return of weapons that were left. It's been exaggerated, the quality and the quantity of those weapons. But here is the one issue that he has against Afghanistan now. For Pakistan now, he would like to see cooperation, and particularly in the counterterrorism vein.
So, Professor Weinbaum, you mentioned counterterrorism, and you looked at U.S. experience with terrorism during 9/11 episode and the years following that very closely. So, what is your view that it was a Republican administration which was in office when 9/11 happened, and more recently, when Mr. Trump returned to White House as another Republican president? You know very well that Pakistan has traditionally enjoyed close relations and more comfortable and cooperative relations with the Republican administrations, be it Nixon, be it Reagan, be it George W. Bush, be it Trump, as compared to perhaps more demanding and less keen Democrats. And secondly, we also know that Afghanistan brought US and Pakistan together and close during the 80s after the 9/11. And again, it seems that not just based on what President Trump said before the US Congress, but the most recently appointed US Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, who has served in the US military for 23 years, also mentioned that the terrorism has risen in Afghanistan and has become a major cause of concern for the US. So do you think that in the forthcoming US national security strategy, perhaps this administration will value terrorism as a greater threat to US national security than the Biden administration? And that provides an opportunity for Pakistan and Washington to come closer?
Well, it also means that now there may be increased pressure on Pakistan to be more cooperative. Michael Waltz, the security advisor before, was very hard on Pakistan in his remarks when he was a congressman, in which he held Pakistan responsible for much of what was going on in Afghanistan, the failure to rein in or crack down on the Afghan Taliban. So he's not singing that song now, because now it is, yes, we will expect Pakistan to do that, but that means pressure on Pakistan, and Pakistan has its own interests to consider here. So we have to see. But one way in which it might be useful for Pakistan is it may embolden Pakistan now, just on the basis of getting this recognition, to take a tougher line on Afghanistan. It may feel that in the name of counterterrorism, that now it may very well take a more aggressive posture, perhaps a greater use of drones, and for targeting within. Now, this will be badly received naturally by Kabul, but and it could intensify the tensions in the region. So I think that Pakistan has to be careful here. It has to be very surgical in what it does here, because what Pakistan doesn't need is an all-out conflict with Afghanistan. Neither country can afford that. But given the fact that Pakistan is experiencing the degree of terrorism, we saw it just yesterday, the day before, it's now being listed as the second most terrorist affected country in the world. based on just on the casualties that have been incurred in Pakistan as a result of mainly TTP action, but also what is going on in Baluchistan.
So, Mr. Weinbaum, you must have read the last UN report regarding Afghanistan, which also mentioned that several regional and global and transnational terrorist organizations have again consolidated themselves in Afghanistan. That includes Daesh, ISIS, ETIM, EMU, and BLA, BLF, TTP, even Al Qaeda as well. And it also warned that they have deep penetration and influence within the senior ranks of the Afghan Taliban. But notwithstanding the previous political stance of the current US National Security Advisor, don't you think the rise of global and transnational terrorist organizations in Afghanistan poses a threat no longer only limited to Pakistan? And the regional countries are feeling the heat. And I'm sure the US, as Tulsi Gabbard also mentioned, it was the manner in which Biden administration planned the exit of the US military is not being appreciated. And so there is a cause of concern which can allow Pakistan and the US to come closer and cooperate in the counterterrorism domain. But more specifically, I want to know, when you classify three categories of terrorist organizations which are operating in Afghanistan according to UN, there are transnational and global organizations like Al Qaeda or ISIS, and there are regional organizations like ETIM and EIMU, and then there are country-specific terrorist organizations like BLA, BLF, and TTP. Which organizations do you think provide an opportunity for Washington and Islamabad to cooperate against?
Well, it's going to be those organizations, and that's limited mainly at this point to Daesh, or call it Islamic State, if you will, and perhaps Al Qaeda, but the capacity of Al Qaeda now seems rather minimal to be able to project terrorism. Yes, it's really the U.S. Will concern itself with those regional, but only marginally. Really, the emphasis now. Now, at the same time, the U.S.'s capacity to be able to deal with Daesh, as well as the others, is very limited. We spoke for a long time about the possibility of what they call over the horizon. The U.S. could be outside the country, but find targets in the country. This is proven to be very minimally effective, because for that you need intelligence. Now, here's where Pakistan.
But let me briefly interrupt you to ask a follow-up question. You would recall very well that it was during President Trump's first administration when Qasem Soleimani was killed as a result of a drone strike. And more recently, in the initial weeks of the President Trump's return to White House, we have witnessed a few calculated surgical strikes against high-value targets of Daesh and Al Qaeda in Syria and also in Africa. So, do you think instead of a large-scale military commitment, which Mr. Trump is unlikely to be interested in, this is the method and strategy which his administration is likely to continue and pursue?
Well, I would love to. But what I'm saying is that in the theater that we're talking about here, Afghanistan, Pakistan, unlike those others, in where the U.S. does have intelligence assets on the ground, it has, because of the U.S. virtual real departure, it has very few. The attack on the second highest ranking al-Qaeda figure in Kabul was a great exception to that rule. There hasn't been anything like that. The only other time in that same period of time when that occurred, when the U.S. went after what they thought were targets in Kabul associated with Daesh, it turned out to be a family that was killed, and that put a real dampener on the willingness of the U.S., given the fact that it had poor intelligence then. Now, the fact that it took out the al-Qaeda figure was probably made possible with inside intelligence and may have been provided by Pakistan. It might have been provided. I've never really seen this definitively identified, them defined, but or with asset within the military in Afghanistan. But I don't really believe that's the case. But in any event, that's the exception that makes the rule here. Those other places, yes, the U.S. will use drones. It has used drones, as we know, for the last 20 years. It used them in Pakistan in the early part of the century. It will use it, but we have all the evidence we have is that if it's going to be effective now, Pakistan would play a major role in that. And yes, whether Pakistan would find it in its interests, how far it would be willing to go to do this, we'll have to see. What I'm getting at is that Pakistan has an opportunity here to further strengthen the relationship, but it's got to do so considering its own interests as well here as to whether it wants, how deep it wants to get into this, and will it improve Pakistan's standing there? Pakistan still needs, above all, a cooperative or more cooperative elements within Afghanistan, and a major campaign here may very well alienate even Pakistan's friends there.
So my second last question regarding Afghanistan is that in your assessment and experience, despite Doha Accord, despite opening of their embassy in Qatar, we have heard more recently about the infighting and the power struggle between the Haqqani network and the Kandahari group. What is your forecast of the stability and the strength of hold on power of the current Afghan Taliban administration?
This is very important because so much of what is going on in Afghanistan has to be seen in the context of the power struggle. And it has not been an outright struggle because, for the most part, those elements who we might call the more independent thinking, I hesitate to say progressives, more progressive, the more independent thinking here have been locked in a disagreement, which has been limited by the fact with disagreement with the hardliners in Kandahar, Hebatullah's entourage, which really doesn't care much about international opinion. It has the most rigid Islamic prescriptions. That's been going on. But something important has happened recently, and that is that the hardliners have virtually taken over. The opposition here has been stifled out for the most part. The most important figure, Sirajuddin, the leader of the Haqqani network, has returned after being in the Gulf and elsewhere for a while, has returned to Afghanistan, but is in effect in hiding in his own area host, where they Haqqanis have their strongest presence. He's hiding there. Stanek Zai is out of the country. There are several other figures who have left Afghanistan who were associated with the so-called Kabul Shura as against the Kandahar Shura. So I don't want to make this too complicated, but what we have seen is that the Emir, Habatullah Akhundzadeh, his full name, has succeeded now in suppressing opposition. And there had been a hesitancy to go this way, to have this breakout, because the Taliban, despite their differences until now, have been hesitant about making a real challenge against him. That is the more independent or progressive, if you want, against him, because of the fear that if they fight among themselves, they will only strengthen Daesh and any other interests that, and also the national resistance groups. Although at the moment they shouldn't be taken too seriously, but they will be strengthened if they fight among themselves. But now that there's such confidence here among the hardliners that they are willing to act and to say we've tolerated enough of this doubt that you've had about our women's policies and several other policies, and you're concerned so much about international opinion and so on. No, the only thing we should keep in mind is that our mission in winning should not be compromised away by anything. And we know what is truly Islamic, and we will dictate that.
So what is the likely U.S. preference and approach towards dealing with this increasing sort of power struggle within Kabul? What does this mean for the U.S. Choices?
Well, it does have consequences, but the U.S. has no leverage to speak of in Afghanistan today. It has already withdrawn its humanitarian assistance. Europe will fill in, perhaps has to fill in that, but it has done that. It has no regular diplomatic contacts. It has the occasional meetings in Doha. So the U.S. is in no position here, having effectively deserted Afghanistan politically as well as militarily. It has no real ability. Its only ability is through others like Pakistan, that it can make itself felt.
So, I mean, this reminds me of another very important issue. You recall in the last 3.5 years, there have been thousands of Afghans who were working for the US-sponsored NGOs and organizations and working with the Karzai administration. And they have applied for visas and settlement in Western countries, including the US. But there is a concern here that the Trump administration might not want to host them anymore.
Well, a real concern, and it is a breach of faith. Many of these people you're talking about, as far as immigration to the United States, were in process. The vetting process is a very complicated one. Pakistan. They went to Pakistan with the Pakistan's understanding that they would leave.
Yes.
Now, given the immigration policy of this new administration, there are many people here in the U.S. who are very upset by the fact that now it seems as if these people are being treated as somehow criminals and dangerous elements here. Here, again, the most careful vetting of who they are, and yet there seems to be no backing off on the part of the Trump administration in admission, or it would have to be accelerated admission of these people. Maybe that will change. There are pressures on them to do so, but at the moment, they stand the possibility, because of Pakistan's desire to have these people leave, to be sent back into Afghanistan, where many of them would be quite in jeopardy.
Okay, that's very comprehensive and insightful analysis, Professor Weinbaum. My last question, a brief comment on the recent meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump. There's a sense in South Asia that the US administration is becoming too demanding from the Indians in order to meet the security expectations against China. And the recent strategic dialogues in New Delhi, it was also witnessed that there was a concern in New Delhi that the US is demanding too much, because you know very well the Indian policy elite highly values their strategic autonomy. So they have their threat perception and concerns vis-a-vis China, but they don't want to be forced into a confrontation and their economic ties. They are under pressure to leave BRICS because Mr. Trump was very candid. You know that anybody who pursues de-dollarization will be completely denied the US market. And secondly, while sitting right alongside Prime Minister Modi in the Oval Office, he accused India of having one of the highest tariff regimes in the world and warned them that they will have the Indian exports will have to bear a proportionate tariff regime. So what does this mean for the future of India-US relations under Trump administration, in your view?
Well, the U.S. values its India connection greatly because it sees it in terms mainly of China. So the U.S. will tolerate a lot from, I think, from India that it would not from any other country. Yes, it mentions the fact that Indian tariffs are perhaps the greatest out there, highest tariffs. But I think there are real limitations here on what the U.S. will cannot afford to turn its back on India by any means. And so your analysis of this, I think, was right on as to what's at stake here. I don't think I could add anything more to that. Again, except to repeat that there is a real decoupling here with Pakistan. There's the U.S. policies are not dependent upon Pakistan policy here. So I don't know if I could add anything more than what you've said.
All right. Thank you so much for sparing your precious time and your very insightful analysis, Professor Weinbaum. So always an intellectual pleasure to hear you and learn from you. Thank you for your time.
It's always been my pleasure to talk with you. Thank you.
Thank you.